Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. We got a treat for you today. We are in Starkville, Mississippi, Mississippi State University, talking to none other than Mr. Bronson Strickland. Bronson, what's up, man?
Everything and nothing.
Yep.
Yeah. Very, very busy, but wonderful time of year, and great to see you two guys. I've heard you so many times over the years, so great to see you in person.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Heard you a lot of times over the years, too. You're a professor here at MSU. You host Deer University podcast as well, and you are kind of the brains behind a lot of the research that people see on social media, some of the papers that we've gone through on our show a couple times. You're like one of the guys that does that, correct? So can you explain your position here?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I forget, I'm one of many brains that does that. So Steve Damaris, he and I work together. We're co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. And really how it breaks down very simply is Steve, his job is research. My job is outreach, so taking that research and making sure it gets disseminated. But I cooperate with him a whole bunch on research. He cooperates with me a whole bunch on outreach. So that's why we're such a good team, and we co-direct the MSU Deer Lab. And then also just wonderful graduate students over the years that are complete deer nuts. And so they like doing what we do, and we couldn't have done any of the stuff we're going to talk about today without them.
Yeah, definitely. And how long has the Deer Lab been around, at least in its current form?
I would say, in terms of our department having a deer focus and so forth, that's been since the 80s. But with me and Steve getting together and trying to more formalize, calling it the MSU Deer Lab and branding it and kind of putting all that together, 2006, 2007 would be what you say in its current form.
Okay,
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
It's been a blast following along because, I think a lot of us as deer hunters over the years have sat around thinking what if I just knew, where is that buck actually at right now with the GPS stuff or, whatever else, whether it be like a deer's eyesight or just general deer biology. There's so much that y'all have put out that's been interesting, including some stuff that's been a little controversial, which we're going to get into.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about GPS stuff. We're going to talk about buck bedding, wind, all kinds of things. It's going to be a great conversation. And before we get too far into it, I brought you a little gift. My wife teaches me to never go anywhere empty-handed. So got you some Blaze Orange Southern Outdoorsman Lucky hats. Jacob packs each one with luck pre-made into it. By the way, Jacob, how are you?
I'm doing real well. Yeah. Our buddy Michael Perry, he got the first generation of those hats and killed the state record muzzler buck 196-inch deer on public land in Alabama.
So that's why we call them lucky hats.
Yeah,
that's
impressive.
There's been a lot of big deer killed with those hats. So maybe have some luck with it. But Bronson, super excited to have you on here. There's a lot we got to talk about. Number one is probably one of the most fascinating things that we as deer hunters and also hosts of our show find when it comes to deer research is specifically the GPS studies. Mm-hmm. Because it's one thing about kind of studying deer in pens and stuff like that when it comes to biology, but it's another thing to see wild deer acting like wild deer, especially in areas that have some kind of hunting pressure, whether it's on public land, a hunting club, maybe a private farm that still gets hunting pressure, and seeing how they react to that, but also just how they like to move around. And y'all just released a study or published a study, which, Andrew, what was the name of it again?
The buck movement one?
Yeah.
Man, dang, you put me on the spot. How, when, and why bucks navigate the landscape.
There you go.
Yep.
There you go.
And we did a whole episode on it, and it was fascinating kind of seeing, again, how these bucks were moving. One of my questions right off the bat that I want to ask you is, what was the age range of bucks that were collared during that study? And what did it kind of look like?
All right, so I told you before we recorded, I had a little something to say to y'all about that.
Uh-oh.
No, it's not bad. So go back in time. We release, and so, I'm an amateur with this social media stuff. We kind of put some stuff out there and hope it works. So we put a link on one of the platforms that, hey, we just published a study. It's available for download, etc. Steve and I fully intended 4, 5, 6 days later that we were going to record a podcast on that topic and go through it on Deer University. It just so happens that before we were even able to record our first podcast on it, y'all beat us to the punch. And so somebody started forwarding me links and, hey, the study, this, that, and the other. I'm like, holy, these guys are Johnny on the spot, man. But I did note in there about we failed to, or at least we didn't describe it well, the buck age structure. So just so you know that we listen, the new version that is online now, we have added that in there.
Awesome.
Cool.
But essentially, here's the breakdown. Is we kind of call it's buck age years. So most of our bucks we had collared for 2 years. So you got a year where it's 2 years old and a year where it's 3. And then when you collared at 4, you had a year at 4, then a year at 5. But when you put all that together, an overwhelming majority, 60-70% or greater, are 3-4.
Okay.
And so we did, the logistics of a study like this can be overwhelming. You got 50 collars, and your goal is to get 3.5 plus or 4.5 plus, but you got to take what the landscape gives you. And so we started being very, very picky of only trying to get 4 or 5, and then eventually you're a month into it or 2 months into it, and you have to start collaring bucks because you want to do the study. And you've only got a student for 2.5 years, so you got to get the ball rolling. But to answer your question, an overwhelming majority are 3-4. Some of those were 5-6. I think we did have 1 or 2 yearlings. So 1 year as a yearling, and then 1 year as a 2-year-old. So I would say normal age structure for the southeast, middle-aged bucks.
Absolutely. And a common age range that most deer are going to get killed at.
That's right.
Most guys might try to pass a 2-year-old. They're going to try, a nice 3-year-old comes by, definitely a 4-year-old, they're going to shoot it. So that's good information as well. For us out here that, that's kind of based off what the study was going on. One quick thing before we get too deep in it, I'm very curious on this. Are y'all doing mostly tranquilizing for deer, or are y'all net gunning? Or I don't know how that works. What's the process?
I am so envious, as is Steve and all of us, of our colleagues in South Texas, that they can do more in one weekend than can be overwhelming for us to do in 3 months. So, I mean, they can literally, with a helicopter and a net gun, they can capture 100 bucks, depending on the site and so forth. Whoa. So we're having to do it more of an individual. We're more or less trying to have to hunt the bucks. And so you're sitting in a lock-on or a climber or a blind over a baited site, with a tranquilizing dart.
Dang.
So it takes.
No wonder it's hard to get all
takes
the
a
big
lot.
ones.
Takes a lot of effort.
Yep.
Yeah.
And these are free-range deer. Are y'all shooting them with like a dart gun at night, probably?
However,
okay,
whatever it takes.
I had
some
a friend
of them
mine,
being at night. Yeah.
Yeah, a friend of mine at Auburn did that. He would be like leaving the apartment. He lived with me, and he was leaving the apartment at like 9:30 p.m. I'm like, where are you going? He's like, I'm going to go dart some deer. I'm like, that's cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that explains that. Where were you going?
No. I mean, I was just kind of fascinated with it because I've had people ask like exactly what the process is specifically on that. Now, kind of getting back to some of these studies, that study, again, your buck movement study was pretty fascinating and had a little controversy, especially I think a little bit later on, y'all started releasing some bedding data and stuff like that people were interested in. We've got a lot of questions on that. But one thing we've got pulled up right here on the screen for us. And again, by the way, guys, if you're listening to this podcast, you want to go watch this podcast as well on YouTube because we're going to have a lot here that Bronson's showing us on the screen. It's going to be screen recorded and actually put into the YouTube version of this podcast. But talk to us a little bit about this study specifically that you've got pulled up here and kind of what all entails because this is a newer study that hasn't quite yet been published, correct?
That's correct. So it's the same study, meaning it's the same bucks and the same collars and all that. It's just looking at the data a little bit differently, having a different question and looking more specifically at bedding. Whereas the other stuff, y'all did the podcast on, it was about general movements and home range and net displacement and this, that, and the other. This is oriented directly towards bedding.
Which is the $1 million question because let me tell you, y'all put out a post, I can't remember, probably a month or 2 months ago, something like that, and it was like the whole whitetail world, mobile hunters, the world burned down. Dan Infalt came out, a bunch of people came out and was, had different thought process on whether they're condemning, the data that was coming out or was in favor of the data. So one thing we need a preference with this is these were deer specifically studied in Mississippi.
Mississippi.
So
that's right.
Southeast deer, Southern deer, Deep South deer. Again, for you guys up in Michigan, Ohio, haven't done a study up there. And up to this point, we kind of talked to us before, and there hasn't been a study like this done that you're aware of in that part of the country, like the upper Midwest or anything like that, correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay,
Yeah.
fascinating. So, again, for our southern hunters, this is something that's really interesting. For you northern guys, and a lot of you guys that watch or listen to the podcast, but, take everything with a grain of salt. What kind of points can we start talking about specifically with this aspect? Because it hasn't been published quite yet, at least some of this data, but like, has there been any kind of interesting factors y'all been finding? Because this is something that everybody talks about. Everybody thinks, well, not everybody. There's a lot of people in the whitetail space that believe a buck may use 1 or 2 beds or maybe 3 beds, something like that, during a length of time period. And, they find these big worn out beds. You see a lot more of this on the public land side. I feel like maybe some private land hunters have the same perspective. But they just find this bed and they think that deer is using this bed exclusively for a long period of time. What have y'all found just recently, just looking at a handful of bucks and everything y'all been looking at?
Well, let me tell you a little bit of background of kind of what generated our interest with this. Was luckily when you have a data set like this, and so this is again from GPS collars. And so we can kind of fine tune those to collect the data at whatever frequency you want. So all the way down to 5 minutes or once a day. The trade-off for a researcher is you got to calibrate what is my question and how long is that battery going to last. Mm-hmm. And if you want to get a location every 5 minutes, that's fantastic, but you only get, I'm making this up, 3 months out of the collar versus I get a location twice a day, I can get 2 years out of the collar. So you got to worry about that. But so when you look at all these points, we've got like 1 million points in space and time for all these different bucks and what they're doing. And I remember one evening, just to show you how much of a nerd I am, it was on a Friday evening at that, and I just was tinkering, and I got to asking this question relative to the things you have always heard, or I have always heard, or grew up with. Mm-hmm. Hunting lore here about the buck's bedroom. And some of this information about these are the characteristics a mature buck is looking for, and this is where he's always going to be. He's also going to typically be dominant, and so he is going to be able to find the best spot on the landscape, and that is where you're going to find him. I just said, I'm just going to start looking at this and testing it. And so I just started pulling out these individual tracks of bucks day by day, and going through and just looking at dots on the landscape and looking at the typical periods of time of when they'd be bedded and when they're moving. And I was like, this is amazing. At least during this time period, scientists, so I got to qualify things, at least over this time period and on this study area, I was not seeing that whatsoever. I'm seeing from day to day to day a buck having a different bed all over the landscape. So I was not seeing this site fidelity absolutely to a particular area, but in terms of going to a buck bedroom, day after day, I was not seeing that at all. So that is what prompted me and Steve to say we need to take a more quantifiable look at this and look at some analytics on it.
So with that, it seemed like they weren't necessarily going to like maybe individual beds per se, but like a general area they were spending more of their daylight time in during bedding. Is that kind of like what you're saying for the most part? Yeah.
So think of it as, and remember, and I'm going to have to say this over and over, bucks are individuals.
Absolutely.
Y'all saw that. I mean, some bucks do crazy things, some bucks do normal things, but so think of it like, a buck may be coming back to an area over and over, but don't think of it as 1/10 of an acre or the size of a truck bed. Think of it as a 20-acre block or a 50-acre block or a 100-acre block or something like that.
And they're just picking different spots in that general area. So that's something that, there was a time when I was more kind of like a lot of the naysayers, like, man, bucks are using individual beds and all that kind of stuff. Andrews, for the most part, I think we tried that one time back in like 2018, and it seemed like we could never figure out a pattern. The Andrews like, absolutely not. Everything I've seen, it seems like, because we hunt a lot of areas that have a lot of clear cuts, a lot of timber management, highly managed timbers, large clear cuts, and there's such an abundance of cover. And the commonality between us and what we've seen with where you're finding deer, jumping deer up, is in and around those thick clear cuts. And I think it'd be a little bit more different. This is something to kind of talk about with the study here, kind of what the habitat was like. But in our area, we have an abundance of security cover. And it's like, why would one buck pick just one individual spot when he has an abundance of places, a bunch of different resources for food, both in that clear cut, also oaks producing in and around in the SMZs around there, the creek bottoms and everything else. But also just be able to have plenty of options because there's a lot of that on the landscape versus an area like some of these guys in the Midwest, small little timber blocks, a lot of agriculture. When the ag gets cultivated and it gets cut out, the deer only have so many places to go and bed up and hide. And I feel like that might be a little bit different, a lot different from what we have down here in the deep south, unless you're in one of these highly managed agriculture areas. But even those areas, it seems like there's a decent amount more cover than what you would find up in the Midwest. Like I've hunted Iowa a few times, and it's pretty easy once you get there. Like, okay, there's deer not going to be inside this tilled up 600-acre field. Nothing's going to be here.
That's right.
That wood block's going to be the only cover within half a mile of this area. That's where the deer are going to be at.
You use the exact word that I use all the time. Most, and we're generalizing when we say deer in the South, but generally in our landscapes, a deer or a buck has options. You mentioned a clear cut. My goodness, whether it's a 50-acre clear cut or a couple hundred, there's not that many very distinguishable aspects. There are so many cover and bedding opportunities within there. But I too, when I work in the Midwest, I'm like, you can see this from the truck at 70 miles an hour. If you scan around 360 degrees, a buck is going to be there or there because there's no other place it could be. And so, yeah, we definitely have to put a context on this in this type of landscape. And you asked a second ago, what is this kind of landscape? It's ideal from my perspective, meaning that it is a wonderful combination of river bottom, the riparian bottomland hardwoods, as well as agriculture on the uplands. So if you just looked from above, you're looking at about a 50-50 relationship of agriculture or openings and food plots and forested cover. So in terms of being able to grow a deer population, provide food for that deer population, it's completely ideal. So and from that, you end up with so many opportunities and places for deer to bed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we talked a couple weeks ago about the bedding thing and how it's confusing because you hear people talk about it, and you can go out in the deep south and you can find those beds that are the size of this table that are dirt and just covered in hair, where it's clearly used a lot. And you find that, and especially if there's like a rub next to it, you're like, buck bed, this is the lair, this is where he lives. And I've only done it one time, but I'm like, why didn't anyone put a camera on one of these? And so I put a camera on one a couple years ago, and we talked about it several times on the podcast. But basically what it ended up being was there was a decent buck that was using it. There was a spike that was using it, and there was a bunch of does that were using it. And there was a deer bedding in it pretty often, like several times a week, but it was almost never the same deer. They were cycling through, and it was just like a nice little shady spot on the side of a reclaimed coal mine that they like to hang out in. And when the leaves dropped, they were gone. Didn't get another picture of a deer for like 2 months.
So it was just first come, first served. Whoever got there took it.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, one of the things I was wondering about with this study is how much of that you've seen. Like, was there ever features that it seemed like deer just gravitated to when it came to bedding? It's like, okay, so they're wanting thick cover, but are they trying to find a thick ridge point? Are they trying to find a thick drainage? Was there ever any consistency with that? Maybe we'll get into it here in a minute.
Yeah.
But anyways,
I can generally answer that right now if you'd like.
Okay, yeah.
We did measure that. Now, keep in mind, in terms of having a lot of topography, we do not. These are flat and agricultural lands. There's a little bit of roll here and there, but this is not Appalachia, or this is not the Rockies or anything like that. These are the flatlands. But what we found is that it is simply what we call screening cover. And that just means a place where a deer can bed down and even stand up, and most of its body is screened via cover. And what was pretty cool about it, and I thought was really good from a management perspective, it really does not matter the form of vegetation. So it could be grass, It could be blackberry or briars. It could be fallen tree. It could be palmetto. Whatever that strategically on the landscape where that deer wants to be, and basically looking around for where can I bed down and something cannot see me. That is where we saw an overwhelming majority of the bed sites.
Yeah, and I think that was in that buck movement paper because there was something in there about deer basically like they're selecting for screening cover, but if your screening cover is also food, you get as bonus points. Like that's what they really like. Can you kind of dive into that a little bit? Like what does that look like on the landscape?
Okay, think of a switchgrass field versus a clear cut.
Okay.
Switchgrass field provides cover. It's not providing any food. Clear cut is providing cover and food. And so basically it's going into those types of bedding sites and what is the composition of the vegetation around it, and is it providing food or not? It's pretty much as simple as that.
I have a total curveball that just came into my head that like might throw us off a little bit, but I have to ask it before I forget. When you were looking at the bedding sites of these deer, I'm assuming like you had them throughout the summer going into the fall. Was there a big difference in the kind of places they wanted to bed in, say, September versus when it's cold outside? So November, December, January, anywhere like in the colder months?
Andrew, that is a good question. That is something I don't recall. We may have covered that in the paper. My memory is that we essentially did that in the fall and winter and didn't really look like in terms of a heat aspect of it, where they go into cool down versus where they may be going to warm up. But we really didn't look at that.
Yeah, because I guess Mississippi doesn't open until
Well, they
October.
got September velvet season now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Limited velvet, but archery's October 1st.
Yep.
Okay, okay. That's kind of what I was
So
thinking.
I think one question that a lot of people are wondering, and I'm curious if y'all have done this, is were you guys able to go out, whether it was grad students or someone, to go out and visually look at areas that different bucks were using for bedding locations and seeing what the cover looked like on the ground? And again, the variabilities. I mean, you talked about some of the different habitat variabilities, but like, did it ever seem like was there any commonality between it? Was it something that was dense enough, they're far enough back in cover that they don't have any visual advantage? It's more like it's more like a hearing scent advantage maybe? Or are they bedding sometimes in areas where they can still see a long ways on some more open cover, but they have some good screening cover in and around them where they can see out of it?
So, if I may, the question may be something like, if you had uniformity of cover, so let's call it a clear cut.
Absolutely.
Would they be more apt to bed on the edge or the interior? I don't remember us really having that many opportunities on that landscape to do that. So I know I don't remember us looking at that question specifically. But I have also received that question numerous times, and that's something I'll try to take a look at. What I remember, the overwhelming result, and let me tell you how we did this real quick. And so we're able to go back in time. So it's like, hey, the month prior, let's find all these places where they are definitive bed sites on the landscape. So we're able to go to that bed site and measure the vegetation, and essentially a measurement that we use for screening cover, how thick it is, can you see through it or not, and then we take random points around it. So we basically take a compass, you got to go this direction, you go this far and do a random point, and that is how we discriminated. There was always 2, 3, 4 times the amount of screening cover in those beds versus what would be random points all around it.
Okay.
That's how we quantified it.
Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Interesting.
So the bed is 2 to 3 times thicker than basically anything else around it. Like that's very consistent.
Absolutely.
Is that something that's specifically to that habitat on that property, that there's not an overabundance of thick cover on that property? It's kind of based off what I'm potentially hearing.
Yes. So if I understood your question correctly, and this is a big deal with me, with Southern hunters and the way we have to kind of reconcile in our mind findings like this is most of the time, Southern hunters, you take what the deer give you, you take what the bucks give you, you take what the landscape gives you. And in our environment, very generally, we have an abundance of cover and a paucity or very little food and quality food, which is just the opposite of the Midwest. You're in an ocean of food and you have very limited cover on the landscape. The opportunity, or a good question could be, what happens if you go in and manipulate the landscape and create really good cover where you want? Are you going to see an affinity to those spots like you see in the Midwest? And I believe, I believe you could do that. So I think if you have bucks, they're going to take the best cover available. So why not go to an area of the landscape where you want them to bed and augment the vegetation so that you create those ideal sites? Now, you can't do that on public land, but on private land you can.
Absolutely. Well, it's like, that's one thing we've talked about. You know, when you're on public land, you have to use what Mother Nature gives you, which is storm damage, unfortunately, timber kill all kinds of bugs, beetles, stuff like that, clear-cut activities, or fire, in order to try to figure out where that cover is going to be out. And especially if you're on an area that they burn, that cover is going to shift. Yeah. Because, what's great for turkey, to give a great example, what's great for turkeys, like that burning, especially like every year, every other year, something like that. For deer, they may feed in some of that, but they're not going to bed in that unless there's fire shadows where they can get in some kind of dense cover, because if it's all burnt to a crisp and there's nothing there for them, they're going to shift. And that's something to really kind of pay attention to if you're hunting some of those areas. But like what you're talking about, finding like the best cover on the landscape more than likely is where the deer are at. I know some individuals like in Alabama that hunt areas that are a little bit more old growth, not really old growth timber, but less managed timber. You don't have a lot of clear cutting activity. And it seems like it's a lot more, like covers a lot more limited in those areas. Yeah. No doubt. They're using terrain more so for bedding. And that's one thing that kind of brings up, I don't know how many other studies y'all have planned in the next 5-6 years. If y'all could do something in North Mississippi, a little more hill country, be very interesting, pine cover. Because I'm looking at, especially when you talk to somebody like hunts, say it's a hunting club or a lease or public land, and it's a lot of slut cut pines. To me, as a bow hunter, unless you have a nice food plot or something you can hunt on, it's a very challenging, especially if there's not a lot of SMZs on the property. For gun hunting, it's pretty good if you can get in a spot and you can see a long ways through that thick cover, and you have a road bed or you have power line, some kind of long straightaway, you can kind of be able to hunt through one of the gaps in the timber. But that's something I'm really interested in seeing, especially like in the future, how deer navigate and bucks use areas with like and even a more abundance of cover, like again, like slut cut pines, where there's a highly managed rotation of the pine management on a property. That's, to me, it'd be very, very interesting. I don't know, have y'all done anything in the past in any kind of habitat like that? Because a lot of this stuff's kind of like towards the delta, or like
it's called the Big Black River Corridor.
Okay.
Yeah. Very good point. And no, we haven't. We do for a completely different study. We don't have the sample size like this, so we don't have 50 or 60 bucks. We might have 3 or 4. But we could attempt to look at that. We couldn't make any, population assessment from that, but we could look at that question and just look at some trends. Sure.
One other question I have, especially about when we're talking about buck bedding. You had 50 to 60 deer or bucks, collared on, this general property. How often were they overlapping those areas? And did you see where at certain times of the year, like that you were, I don't know if you had enough bucks to potentially almost have like part of a bachelor group, but knowing this area, I think this area, they're rutting in what time, January or December?
Yeah, call it December and January.
Okay, late December, early January. Yeah. Was there any kind of shift of bucks using specific areas, like kind of somewhat together? Maybe not all of them, but like you'd have a group of bucks kind of using a general area and kind of seeing how they would overlap or even switch out bedding areas?
I don't think we looked at that.
Okay.
That's a very good question. And one thing that we have to say, or I should say, is that is the type of question that's very good. It's very interesting. The amount of data that we have to go through is you have to write code to answer questions.
Okay.
And so that is, like I was telling you also earlier, we have a mathematician now that's working with us. And so we can provide these types of questions and she can write code and give us an answer. But we typically look at things in the aggregate of just, in this particular area, count the number of beds. And that's something that you can quantify and do with code versus it would take one of us going day by day with the buck and counting the points and writing a number down and, trying to calculate it that way. It'd be overwhelming.
Yeah, you'd almost need, Andrew's done this with a study we had from, was it Auburn? Where he pulled up pins. How many bucks did we pull up on that study, you think?
I have no idea.
We did a video where we pulled
A
them
bunch.
up. Andrew was able to overlay them. Was it on Google Earth?
Yeah.
Where
Well, it wasn't Google Earth. It was QGIS.
okay,
Or Arc Pro.
but able to plug all the points in from all these different bucks and kind of look at them real time of like, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 bucks in this one area of kind of where they were at. And it never seemed like we had one example where these 2 bucks lived on 2 different drainage systems and they never would cross a specific ridge. They would each come up to it, not at the same time, but they'd come up to a ridge and they would never cross that ridge and they'd go right back into their kind of home territories. It was interesting kind of seeing the dynamic of, the buck. That wasn't all the bucks, I'm sure, collared in this area or that was living in this area, but how like each of them kind of had their general area and every now and then they would overlap, but they weren't ever together per se. At least that I remember.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask about too is like you've made the point that these studies, like when you get all this data back, I mean, it's just like a pile of raw data sitting there that you have to go through, and you can get so many different questions answered through that, but it takes a ton of time, and like you really have to apply yourself to actually look at these questions and answer them. So it moves really slow, and a lot of these studies, like the one that we looked at from Auburn, they were looking at home range excursions specifically, and there's so much more that can be done with that. So it's like you could have someone that their entire job is just like looking at this data for the next 10 years or something, and they could get so many questions out of it. But one of the things I wanted to kind of segue into is,
and so y'all could help me fund that person to do that work.
oh yeah,
I'll just slip that in there.
we
Because
could find
you're
a
exactly
way.
right.
We could crowdfund it. I'm curious about how you determined a bedding site from the GPS data. So what, like, there's probably some people listening, thinking about this data, and they're like, well, how did you actually know that the deer was bedded down? Because the caller is not telling you, like, this deer is laying down right now. It's just giving you a point in space. So how did you guys do that?
Yeah. So essentially, again, we were getting a location every 15 minutes. And so what we have to do quantitatively, because we're writing code, is you got to come up with a rule. And our rule was that you have to have 4 consecutive points. So 15 minutes and then 30, 45, an hour, where they were in less than a 20-yard radius. Now, you might be asking, 20 yards in a bed? You got to keep in mind that GPS collar is being triangulated by satellites, and there's trees and so forth. So essentially, we get an error rate for a collar or for a group of collars, and we kind of determine that if we don't have a difference of 20 yards or 30 yards or whatever, then the deer or the buck or the animal is not moving. So you do have to make a little bit of assumptions there. But what we found with our data in that landscape that was pretty safe was we needed 4 or more consecutive points where the deviation from point 1 to point 2 to point 3 to point 4 was 20 yards or less. And we felt we were very safe concluding that deer is bedded. And so we also did not call a bed if it was in a food plot, because it would be possible, it may not be very likely, but it is possible you could have a deer foraging and meandering around in a very small little circle or figure 8 where it did not deviate from that 20 or 30 yard radius. And so in that case, we just eliminated anything that was in fields or in a food plot. Because some people, I've seen them too, a deer will bed down occasionally in a food plot.
Especially at night, too.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Or
late
underneath a
afternoon.
feeder. They'll
Right.
lay right next to, or a scrape, lay right next to the scrape for 2 hours.
So we excluded those types of observations. So that's what we called a bed.
Now, also, one other thing we're talking about, because we have one deer in particular here pulled up. I got a couple questions. Number one, Was there ever a factor where y'all went in and investigated some of these bed sites where maybe they were underneath just a really hot feed tree that those deer were spending a ton of time underneath the kind of the canopy of those trees?
Yeah, it would have been difficult for us to determine how hot the feed tree was because we're getting the data, in the past, so we're getting data that might have occurred a week or 2 or 3 or longer, and then we have to compile them and find these points. So the white oak has already dropped.
Well, I guess it'd be one of those things, if you went in and investigated one of those bed sites, you would notice more than likely there's probably not a lot of bedding screening cover in that specific area as well. But also, one important question I have is, did y'all average out roughly during any point of the season how many beds like one of these bucks may use during, say a week or 3-4 week time period? Because that's a very common point that's being brought up, that some people think they might use 4 or 5 beds, some people think they might use 1 or 2 beds or whatever. So
there's your answer right there. So what you're going to see on the x-axis down at the bottom is we have broken the rut up into 2-week intervals. And so I know there's some non-conventional name. We usually say pre-rut, rut, post-rut. But we have a pre, an early, a peak, a late, and post. And that is just basically taking all of the breeding season and breaking up into 2-week intervals. And so what you'll see is over that whole hunting season, the average is 4. So the number of beds per buck per day. So that is just on the average, hunting season and the rut, etc. But then you will notice now those bars are showing you 2-week intervals. And so then you will see the number of beds per buck for rut phase in the pre-rut is 56.
So for 2 weeks,
over
they're
2
using
weeks.
50. Now, is that different beds or just they're bedding like
different beds?
Different bed. Okay. So
Holy
now
smokes.
this
Wow.
makes way more sense now that you explained this, because I saw something similar of a chart like this because someone was mentioning y'all were doing that, looked at the beds during the rut and like, well, of course bucks are going to move a bunch during the rut, but I didn't realize this is a 10-week time period we're looking at. Like this whole from pre-rut through the early rut, peak rut, late rut, post-rut, the whole 9 yards. We're looking at a 10-week period of time, which is a lot better than I was thinking, because I was thinking this based off someone had said. I'm like, okay, maybe they're looking at 3 or 4 weeks. I'm like, okay, that's cool, but that doesn't help me out a whole bunch, because I'm kind of interested in buck bedding outside of that main peak breeding period of time. So that's super, super interesting.
Also, it's interesting to note that in the early rut and peak rut, the number of bedding sites decreased. Is that just because they're literally up running around more and they're not bedding as often?
That's our explanation, yeah. They're just on their feet more. And we can run some algorithms, too, about a buck's behavior or any animal's behavior just based on this stuff gets really complicated. But essentially, we can determine, are they walking, are they foraging, and it's all based on the speed that they're taking and the complicated route. But the data are very clear in terms of exactly what you think. When during the peak rut, they are moving more, they're walking more, and they're bedded less. And so, yeah, you see that right there.
I want to do 2 things here. First off, I want to specify for listeners. And again, if you're listening, you go to YouTube and watch this right now. If it's up on YouTube, might not be up on YouTube quite yet. In a 2-week time period, these bucks are averaging just over 55 during the pre-rut, 55 beds, different beds in a 2-week time period. That is insane, especially in an area, even like what you're saying, because the way you describe this property, roughly being, 50% somewhat agriculture, open ground, and 50% hardwoods or timber. I thought it would minimize the locations of buck bedding in that. Versus if I was in clear cut, I'm like, okay, I can see this. But even like where you're at, that's really fascinating to me, first off. But also just the way the data is laid out to kind of give somebody a perspective of like how much variables there are with this. Because I'm sure there might have been one, maybe, I don't know if y'all went through each individual buck. Maybe one buck was slightly more of a homebody compared to all the other ones, and maybe he liked his 5 or 6, 8, 10 spots that he liked the most. But for an average, that's pretty wild. Also, can you give us this is a 10-week time period? What are y'all classifying as the pre-rut? If this is like rutting kind of like late December, January time frame, would that be kind of like late November? Are we talking about here?
That's exactly right. So consider peak there right around Christmas.
Okay.
So then you're backing up. The early rut would be earlier December. Pre-rut, we're talking the last 2 weeks of November, something like that.
Wow.
Man, that's fascinating.
That is actually really fascinating.
That is super cool. So beds per buck per day. So I'm assuming, just to clarify also, when you say day, you mean 24-hour time period, not daylight hours.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. 24 hours.
I'd also be curious if there's been a distinction between, do they basically select different beds in the nighttime versus the daytime hours? I don't know if that's something y'all have looked at, but it's like in the daytime, or they're just in the thicket, but in the night they're maybe a little bit more loosey goosey about where they bed. That maybe they'll lay up in that big white oak bottom or whatever.
Yeah, that deserves a closer look. With what we've done so far, we haven't seen any difference that stood out to us. It's
Okay.
almost like a bed is a bed.
Can you talk a little bit too about, so like I read in the paper that to determine the sites you had, you like kind of like you just explained, he would have to be in a spot for 4 consecutive 15-minute intervals with less than a 20-yard difference. I think I read something else too about y'all were looking at how often how do I put this? How often the points were essentially like zigzagging around, bouncing around rather than moving in a straight line. So, and I think it was described as like if you're like walking down the street to your neighbor's house versus if you're in your own house, you're going to the kitchen, then you're going to the bathroom, then you're going to the living room, and it's very like erratic, kind of jumping around rather than point A to point B. Can you explain that a little bit? Hopefully, I didn't just make that up.
No, you're right. So the complexity of how a buck is zigzagging on the landscape, the term for that is tortuosity.
No way I was going to remember that word.
Say that.
Tortuosity.
I'm not even going to say it, Jacob.
No way. Absolutely not. I'm good. Torch.
So if it's a straight line, then it is not tortuous. So
Okay.
I don't know where we come up with those words, but that's
Or
the word
blame
we
it as
use.
Latin for something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could call it complexity.
Okay.
How about that? So yeah, for that we looked at. Of course, there was a lot of different ways we looked at it, but there was a difference in the total distance that a buck moves. And so I think the way we expressed that in the paper was a buck could move a mile a day, but it may not be moving very far from where it started, let's say at midnight to go to midnight the next day in a 24-hour period. The distance of where the buck started and where the buck ended, and that distance we call net displacement. So it is moved to a completely different area. The more tortuous the pathway, the more close that net displacement value is going to be.
I got you. So his caller may record that he moved 2,500 yards today, but from point A to point B, he only moved like 800 yards.
That's right.
Gotcha.
That's
okay.
right.
And so those are more of your, he's zigzagging around. He's staying in a pretty tight area. And while he's moving a lot, it's not like he's covering miles and like moving out of an area, correct?
With the exception of excursions, correct.
Okay.
One thing, y'all may have heard me talking about this. I mean, there's so many little interesting facets here to talk about, but one of them that really stuck with me, and I'm probably a weirdo, but this is really important to me, was you've heard all the time, and you probably did that with the Auburn data, is that we will do annual home ranges. That's the most common when you see it reported, an annual home range, or a seasonal home range, meaning fall or the hunting season. We calculated daily home ranges. So I'm thinking about this from a hunting perspective. So on any given day, how much area is this buck going to be using? And it was remarkably consistent that if it was outside the hunting season or the pre-rut or the post-rut, the daily home range of a buck was 200 acres. Now, when you combine that with that net displacement stuff, we notice that when you are outside of the rut, a buck is still using 200 acres a day, but there's a tremendous amount of overlap in those little 200-acre polygons, okay? So they might be, using a larger acreage over a month, but every day it's 200 acres. But there's 50% overlap from Tuesday to Wednesday of the next 200 acres. But then when you get to the rut, they're still using 200 acres a day, but now the net displacement, those 200-acre polygons are further apart. And I'm using my hands, I know.
No, it's okay for video. The
Hey,
video.
you better go to YouTube, baby.
But that's super. So was that consistent kind of across the board for most bucks?
Well, we calculated a population average, so I'm sure there were individual differences.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what we saw.
That's fascinating.
That makes me think of that 10 point in the club.
Man, I got this stupid deer that we're
Hey,
hunting.
you might need to start putting together some 200-acre polygons on it where you've had them located the most.
Yeah.
So
there's like this pine thicket on one part of the club that you'll get him and you'll get him and you'll get him, and then he is gone. You're like, he's dead. And then bam, there he is again. He showed back up. And I was wondering if it could have been something like that, because a good buddy of mine is in the club, and he's also he owns land that adjoins the club, and he just knows a lot of folks, and he has access. I mean, he can hunt like 8,000 acres right there or something. And we would just lose this deer for like a long period of time, like a month or two at a time, and then he would just show back up, and we're like, where is he going? And I don't know. It's just like he's kind of. I thought he would be a homebody, because when he's there, you get him a bunch.
Well, when you check your cameras, he was on other cameras that you didn't know he was on that were non-cellular.
Yeah.
So I mean, he was still kind of there. He just wasn't showing up on some of the more the cameras he was at earlier in the season. But
there were still like long absences. So I'm wondering if it's like kind of the 200-acre theory that you're talking about, where we're just like kind of on the periphery of his range, and he's maybe he's living over in the grown up neighbor's place that that was cut 20 years ago and they never did anything with, and no one hunts it.
we got to dive down this rabbit hole. I'm doing the hand motion from like back in the day. So Bronson, back in the day when we had a guest on, it wasn't video podcast, I would do this hand motion for everybody. Dive down the rabbit hole. We're going to stay on this topic for a minute. Number one factor I want to talk about with like this 200-acre kind of daily use for a buck on average, how much is habitat and forage availability a factor for that size? Like, do you think that would relate to everywhere, or just kind of based off the test sites and the sites that you're looking at right now?
Yeah, I cannot say that would hold in West Virginia or would hold in North Texas. I think that is very, very landscape dependent. And so you can easily imagine that if your resources are more sparse and spread out, then it's probably not 200 acres. It might be 500 acres. Mm-hmm. But in the context here, it was about 200 acres.
Now, in areas with even more, I'm just thinking in areas with even, well, I mean, it seems like y'all have a ton of food on this property, like different forage species and everything available. If I kind of go back to like clear cut country, if he's got 3 different age clear cuts, like one that's a year old, that's got all this fresh growth. He's got one that's, 2-3 years old. He's got one that's 5-6 years old that maybe he's just kind of more bedding, or jumping around from bedding locations. And then also like a couple creek bottoms there and everything else. I could almost imagine it could be potentially even smaller during certain points of the year, because I mean you have so much going on in one of those areas. But that is super interesting. Let me ask you, as a hunter, what does that mean for you, knowing that data? If you have trail cameras out and you're catching buck, like a specific buck on camera, is that something that you're kind of processing in the back of your mind of like, how is he using this area based off how frequently I'm getting him on camera, what other cameras I'm getting on, in order to try to get a bigger picture of exactly how he's using the landscape and how much he's using during specific days? Well,
let me tell you the way I think about it and the way I wish I could apply it if I had a bunch of time to do it and the hunting property was set up, is I tend to think, and I even think about habitat management in this regard now as well, is looking at in 200 or 300 or 400 acre blocks on a landscape, is in this 300 acres, where's the most likely cover spots going to be? Where is most likely the foraging spots going to be? If I own the land or I'm advising someone on the land, if I see a big gap there, having this knowledge is we need some cover in this area. And so then I'm just thinking, all right, how could I maximize my odds? It would be, let's just say that we did have a nice grid of 200 to 300 acre spots on the landscape. And we do have very definable, these are cover patches. Here's a cover patch. Here's a cover patch. I'm thinking I'm increasing my odds looking for corridors in between those cover patches. And I might have to sit there for 2 days. I might have to sit there for 2 weeks. But I think eventually you're going to have a circuit of where that buck is going to go through there, hopefully during daylight hours.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, that's something that I wanted to end up getting into is those circuits or travel corridors specifically, and if there's any kind of anything that you found of how bucks are using the landscape to travel and avoid people, hopefully, or if they're just like choose one thing over another. But before we kind of start segueing into that, is there anything else with the bedding, like in the slideshow or anything, like any slides we need to look at?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because
way to stay focused.
I don't want to miss this because there's so much here that like I don't want to.
So that's a slide. We were talking earlier about the net displacement data, and so you just see a great disparity there. So remember, what was that word again? Tortuosity.
Torture something. Yeah. It's torturous to say it.
Torturous to say it.
So notice what we're calling the late rut. Notice that biggest bar there.
Ooh, I have questions about that.
You've got about 700-yard difference there between where it was 24 hours earlier.
Okay.
So
now,
remember if the net displacement was really low, then where it started at midnight and then where it started 24 hours midnight the next day, they'd be really close together if the net displacement was very short. And like it does in the pre-rut, that's only a little under 500 yards.
So to explain, when we're talking about net displacement, this is the change in movement from these different time periods, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So that is not saying the buck moved 700 yards in a day. It's saying from where we took its first measurement and 24 hours later we took the measurement again. That is the distance between those points.
point A and point B.
Point A. Yeah.
Okay. Every year we've talked about this on actually the podcast we did on y'all's paper, where we were like when the rut comes in. Let's take an area, for instance, where your peak rut is like December 15th, for instance. Right around Thanksgiving, you start seeing some young bucks acting stupid, some bucks getting killed. Early December, like working on up to the 10th, the 15th, like it's going. Like a lot of bucks are getting killed. And then you kind of hit that peak rut around the 15th or so. And, it's the rut. It's good hunting. But then you get to around Christmas and like, I'm referencing a specific area I used to hunt. I used to be winding down. Rut's kind of winding down. And then the diehard guys who were like still in there and really knew what they were doing.
Killed hammers.
That's when they're killing giants. Like that's when the biggest bucks were getting killed is that late rut. So I'm curious of your opinion on that now looking at this chart, which seems like that makes perfect sense looking at this chart.
I buy that 100%. And the way I look at it, it's the frequency of does that are in estrus over time. And so in the pre-rut, we have does that are coming in estrus because it's a rut, but it's the early part of the rut. So we have a smaller percentage of does that are in estrus and receptive. As such, there are more bucks looking for those few does that are in estrus. So you hear successful trophy hunters. I'll say this all the time. Pre-rut and post-rut. During the peak rut, it's like all bets are off.
It's a crapshoot.
It's like random, just time in the tree type thing. Because sure, they're all out there and they're moving, but more than likely on a probability scale, they are with a doe, and you hope the doe comes by you. Okay, so now we're on the other end of that bell curve. In the late rut, just like in the pre, there's fewer and fewer does that are in estrus, meaning a buck has to look more for available does in estrus.
Yeah, and could it be too that in the late rut, like maybe he's kind of run through his does in his area, and so now he's expanding out and he's like having to go look harder in different areas for different doe groups?
Possibly so. Possibly so.
Because man, we had a guy. We drew Kansas this year, so we're going to Kansas.
Good for you.
Pretty excited. And we had a guy tell us that we need to go like around Thanksgiving because that late rut time period. He's had good luck out there, and I'm like, that sounds good, but I'm kind of scared to do that because also by Thanksgiving, a bunch of the bucks are dead.
Yeah.
A bunch of them have got killed.
That's the downside.
So there's less of them to hunt. But if you're going for that big deer, that booner, that might be the time to do it. I don't know.
Well, also, so one factor, and we talked about this a bunch of the podcast, and I'm very interested in getting your take when we're talking about the rut here. Down in the deep south, we have such variabilities in a lot of our states on when the rut takes place. And one thing we hear complaints a lot, and we both have experienced this as well, when you're hunting a specific part of, say, Alabama or Mississippi that is running that late December, January, in some parts of Alabama, late January timeframe, you're so far past leaf-off conditions, and there's been so much hunting pressure that it seems like these deer get bottlenecked into very tight, specific cover that might be like a 4-year-old, 5-year-old clear cut. You can't see into it. Pines are 8 foot tall. And it makes where, for at least some individuals, it's happened to us as well in some of these areas, your observation of seeing deer goes down for, I think, 2 reasons is my thought. The amount of pressure we've had since season opened October 15th, and our super long gun season we have in Alabama, kind of like Mississippi as well. But also with the leaf off conditions, there's less viable cover versus what it was like even in early December when we might have had maybe a couple of frosts, but nothing significant in order to kill off a lot of vegetation. What is your thought process on that when you have like the variability in some of these different areas of these states that have rut time frames that are, different, maybe by a month or more? How do you think that would affect a hunter, or maybe you have some personal experience with that, or maybe data on those deer specifically using more of those tighter, thicker locations based off hunting pressure, but also lack of cover because it's later in the season?
Yeah, I would think it is mostly a function of hunting pressure. And I think you've got an interaction there as well. So I would say if you had a less amount of cover, but no hunting pressure, probably not a big difference. But when you couple those two together, it's probably the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah.
Another thing our current analyst, Natasha, did that was just a very clear and obvious effect of hunting pressure in a way that would be very tangible for hunters is that hunting food plots. And I don't know about y'all in Alabama, but in Mississippi, hunters spend a lot of time hunting food plots.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You should come to my club. there ain't a yearling safe on those food plots.
What our analyst's name is Natasha. What Natasha did was looking at, from these collared bucks, the same population we're talking about, the entry time. So when they go to a food plot in the afternoon, what time are they entering the plot relative to sunset? And month by month, week by week, it gets later and later and later, such that when you're in bow season, you got those bucks entering that food plot easily an hour before sunset. The time when we typically start expecting to see deer. The does are coming out, and then you're hoping the buck, all that's completely normal. But then as time goes by over the season, then it goes from an hour before to 30 minutes before to right at sunset. And then when you get to that last month of deer season in this study area, they're coming to the plot an hour after sunset. And that's just all hunting pressure. That is just habitually them coming, and even if there's no gunshots, but they're detecting that you're there, and they're changing their behavior.
Now, do you think that's something that would translate outside of just food plots? Like that could also easily be your little SMZ creek drainage that's got 3 or 4 white oaks in it that some people have been hunting. Could it translate like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I can't prove that with our data, but I don't see why that mechanism would be any different. Okay. I mean, it's just disturbance at a particular place, and the deer are learning, when I go there, I keep smelling humans. Yep. And so I'm going to go at a different time.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I feel like you see that a lot with feeders too.
Well, and right? That's where I think a lot of guys burn themselves, because you see this on Facebook all the time. We're talking about Facebook earlier before we start recording. people are like, I've got this big buck coming to a feeder. I've got him on camera 2 hours after dark. I'm going to go and hunt him. And it's like, you're going to make it so much worse. Like, maybe you haven't hunted quite yet, but once you start going in there, he knows you're there. If you only have a small little area that you're hunting, there's so many people, it seems like they want to hunt right on top of their cameras.
Yeah.
It's like they get a buck on camera. I'm sitting right there. Like, I'm not trying to figure out point of travel, like where he's coming from or where is he going, to try to cut the distance in order to try to get him during daylight hours. And I feel like that probably burns so many people. But then again, Andrew's Club's a great example. A lot of guys hunting. I mean, 98% of the people in his club are hunting food plots all year. But every now and then someone will get lucky. And, president of the club killed a really nice mature buck on a food plot that was probably worn out, and it just happened to be the day that buck wanted to go from one clear-cut bedding area to another clear-cut bedding area, crossing a power line on that food plot.
Got killed at like 6 a.m.
And he got
right at first light, and he was crossing it.
And he got hammered. But
yeah, he done good. He was hanging out with his girlfriend too late.
Yeah, but that is interesting, kind of seeing like the data Natasha was looking at and kind of seeing how it kind of, as the months went on, it got later and later and later, which kind of makes you think, it's one thing when you're on private land, especially if it's like you own the property, you can kind of control who's hunting, when they're hunting, all that kind of stuff. And maybe you kind of, like, I've heard of some like really nice clubs that, they, during the rut, like before the rut, during the rut, they're not, you can't shoot does on food plots, or they have stands set up where it's specifically for gun hunting, where you're way off a food plot, hopefully with a good wind, where deer should never know you're even in the general area to come out to a food plot. But I hunt mostly public land. Andrew's now hunting some private land. Doesn't hunt public land a whole bunch anymore now.
Easy.
So it's a little bit different scenario. I don't hunt food plots on private land, or on public land, I mean. But, where I see like that pressure difference, like what you mentioned, it's got to be directly related to pressure, because you'll go to state park where you can't hunt, and there'll be deer in wide open hardwoods that you can see 300 yards through, and they don't care.
Absolutely.
Bed down in it, the whole 9 yards. But again, in some of these areas that they rut later in the season, there's been so much pressure, and guys getting out there trying to find a deer, and it's like they just get sucked tight, and they're very, very aware of what's going on. So that's super interesting.
Completely agree.
Now, also, while we're on these slides, because I've got some other points I want to bring up, but is there any other notable details worth kind of bringing back up when it comes to like the, I guess, the breeding and bedding aspect of everything?
So let's see. So here's fidelity over the entire hunting season. And so we're seeing, we had some questions about how often are they going back. Well, most of the time, a bed is one and done. And so that's what these slides are showing you here, the number of visits per buck for a particular bedding area. And we called a bedding area, we gave a little more slack or a little more latitude. It didn't just have to be a 20 acre. We expanded that out and called it a bedding area versus a site.
20 yards or 20 acres? No, you said...
I'm going to...
Oh, okay.
I'm going to find that answer for you.
Okay, excellent.
100 yards.
100 yards. Okay.
No, whoa. Let me make sure. Sorry. Yeah, bedding sites are separated by other sites greater than 100 yards.
Okay.
So if you look at that, we would have two in what said bedding area 1 right there. Those would be two distinct bedding sites, but one bedding area. So if they're within 100 acres of each other, we're calling them a bedding area.
100 yards of each other.
Within 100 yards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just clarify. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. If it's greater than 100 yards, they would be distinct and separate.
Okay, fascinating.
Areas.
Definitely go to YouTube to look at this visual, because that visual helps me a ton.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, let me ask, or I'll let you keep going through the slides. I do have another point.
This is real quick.
Okay.
Most of it's about 50% of the time is one.
Okay.
And then we've got about 35, 6, 7. They will use it 2 to 5 times. Some of them then from 6 to 600 are used less than 20% of the time. And then there's just a very, very few, what is that number? Less than 5% are used over and over again.
Okay.
So yeah, in terms of some of the questions you asked earlier, are there some places? There are very few of them.
Absolutely.
But most of them are one and done, and then certainly less than 5 times they're used.
For bedding. That's super fascinating. By the way, while we're talking about, and we're kind of talking about some rut here as well, what kind of data do you have on does and dove movement? Because I'm very interested in that and seeing how it potentially relates to some of this buck movement in bedding and all that kind of stuff.
Unfortunately, we have very little data on the does, and some of the information we have reported on Facebook recently are from different studies, different questions that required us collaring a doe. So, gosh, probably if we have 100 bucks collared, we'll have 10 does.
Okay. Is there anything, though, that you've seen based off some of these past studies of home ranges for does, different, the difference between that and their relation to the habitat compared to what bucks are doing?
So it certainly appears, but at a lesser rate,
Okay.
that some does are doing some crazy stuff, crazy excursions, crazy home range shifts, just like some of the bucks are. But I would just say it is a much, much less rate. So from that publication y'all covered, we generally saw that about 30% of the bucks are what we called a mobile home range personality, just meaning they have distinct home range part of the year, and then they have, they get up and move far away, and that might be up 2 miles away, it may be 20 miles away. So we call that, a mobile personality. Whereas about 70% of them are what we would call this traditional sedentary, just a regular home range. So, but we're seeing some of that mobile personality behavior with does as well.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this fidelity by rut phase. So number of bedding areas visited, and then it's broken out by phases of the rut again. So interesting. So pre-rut, number of bedding areas visited. Is this per day? I'm guessing maybe.
Well, that would be by rut phase. So every 2-week interval.
So
Yeah, the number of bedding areas visited during a rut phase.
Okay, so pre-rut, 6 different bedding areas visited on average in the pre-rut, and then early rut you're up to 9, peak rut 10, late rut back down to 9. So I mean, just perfect little bell curve.
And again, defining a bedding area, it's 100-yard in diameter, rough area.
Yeah, it would be one or more bedding sites,
Okay.
kind of within a 100-acre area.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was there. Again, we've talked about it like before on the podcast, but we had that GPS data we were looking at from Auburn, and there was one buck in particular. This is like super interesting, where he had this little hardwood SMZ that he wanted to go eat in every night, and so he would go down there, and then he would go back up into this pine thicket. There's like a hill that went up out of this SMZ, and it was thinned pines. Like I went back in the imagery to the dates that he was there, and they had thinned it the year before, so you can imagine what it probably looked like in there. And it was 27 nights in a row that he would go up in that pine thicket and then go down in the SMZ, up in the pine thicket, down in the SMZ. But it was never the same exact spot. So he was never going and bedding in the same exact spot. And per your criteria, it probably would have ended up being like, I don't even know how many bedding, like a bunch of different bedding sites, but probably 4 or 5 distinct bedding areas within that pine thicket, where like one day he's over here in this corner, and then the next day he's in the other corner, and then the next day he's in the middle, and then now he's down here on the edge.
Yeah.
And he just totally ping-ponged around in there. And same thing in the hardwood SMZ as well. He was not going to the same tree, it seemed, every night. He'd be down on this spot one day, and then the next night he would pop out 150 yards up, and the next night he'd be way down here. And I was going through looking at it. I'm like, how would you kill this deer? Like, I'm sure he's
question.
laying down all kinds of great sign in there. Probably doing some little old whip rubs down in the bottom, but I'm like, I don't know how you'd kill him, like for real, like with any certainty, because you want to be able to just be like, here's his trail, he's coming out, but there's really like no good way to determine that. I mean, you're truly like, it's kind of luck of the draw in that situation, right?
He's probably going to use that trail again, but it may be 2 weeks later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And you just hope you're there on the right day.
yeah, exactly. It's very confusing. So what is this circuit time?
Okay, let me see if I can get this right here. So circuit time is, I guess, to address the issue of how often are they going to come back to that particular bedding area. So we've already kind of established that it's very rare. most of the time they're going to a bedding site, one time. But on those occasions where they do have fidelity and they're coming back over and over, we looked at the amount of time that elapsed for their return. And again, that is broken up by those 2-week rut phases. And so the y-axis is days between consecutive visits at those. And so again, for the handful, the small amount of time they do show fidelity, that is the amount of time that it takes before they return to that spot. And that's in days.
So the shortest interval was during the pre-rut, which is just over 1.4 days between site visits. And then the highest variability was early rut, which is about 1.65 or so days. So
perfect.
Just over 1.5 days between the difference of them. So that's interesting. But again, it's interesting to see, but y'all didn't see that happen very often, though. So it's a super small number of times they actually went back to the same bedding sites.
Right.
Not bedding areas, bedding sites specifically, which is that 20-yard, wide area.
Man, I just know right now that everyone listening is like screaming at their radio because they're like, what did those places look like? The places with really high fidelity that the bucks were coming back to over and over again. Even though there's very few of them, is there any consistency? Let's say there's like 8 of them. Is there any consistency between what each of those look like? Do they have a certain kind of cover type? Are they on a certain kind of feature?
Or also the outlying factor, what specific bucks were doing it? Was it just a handful of bucks, the ones that were out also doing it? Out of the 60, there was only 5 really doing this.
We need to start a GoFundMe where we just like...
we need fun grad students to go hire and be like, go look at this stuff for us.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
So many questions.
Those are great questions. Mm-hmm. Those are great questions. And this slide here was just about essentially there's no difference in the number of day beds versus night beds. It's just showing that it's pretty much 50-50. You got about the same amount. You got a 1.75 during the day and 1.5 at night.
Did y'all look at the intervals of when they were on their feet versus when they were in beds? And was there any consistency with it based off different timing of, when y'all were looking at this?
Yeah, this is one, please don't quote me, but I'm thinking like 4 hours or so.
On their feet.
Interval on their feet, bed.
For like 4
to 6, bed 4 to 6.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I was actually about to bring up that same point because I re-listened to the podcast we did on the way over here on the paper, and I think I read something in there that was about like in a day they would have like roughly 4 beds, which is what we went over earlier, but they were getting up and essentially moving every 4 to 6 hours, I believe is what it was. So they're not like sedentary where they go and sit in a spot. I mean, they might do that sometimes, but on average, they're not. It's not like they make it to that daytime bed and they are laying right there until it's dark, and then they're getting up and leaving. Like they are getting up every couple hours, stretching their legs and moving. And now, just going back into a little bit of general deer biology, what is like their feeding clock like? I mean, do they have to get up and feed like every 4 hours, or I mean, what are they doing?
It typically follows that clock on a 4 to 6 hour, and so that's relative to, and this differs timing of the rut for bucks, and are they focused on food that time of year? But a nutrition person or an animal science person, we call it passage time. Meaning when they eat a food and it goes in their rumen and they ruminate it, how long does it go through before it's excreted? Mm-hmm. And so it's really just the rumen is then emptying, and it depends on the complexity of the food and et cetera. But yeah, think of that 4 to 6 hour time is when they're going to get up and feed again.
A total side note, I'm sure this depends on buck does and size of bucks and does and all that kind of stuff. What kind of studies have been done on like the amount of like poundage or volume of food a deer has to eat in order to hold a body weight or put on body weight?
Think of it as a percentage of their body weight.
Okay.
And we're generally, if you were to remove the water weight from it, it's going to be about 2.5 to 3% of their body weight each day to maintain their weight. assuming it has the average amount of calories and so forth. So you can be thinking of, for a buck, that's going to be 5, 6, 7, depending on water weight, 5, 6, 7 pounds of food that they're eating. You'll have to go into the archives on Facebook, and I bet it's on YouTube, but Steve and I demonstrated this concept. And so we went out and looked at what is the biomass of food in the field with the water weight, and we did leaves. What does it look like, the amount of foliage that a buck would have to eat to meet its dietary requirements for a single day? And we had a tote, a little plastic tote, about yay big and about yay deep. In other words, on the table we're at right now, you could take that tote and pour it out. It would spread out over this entire table and would be mounded up about yay high. That's $1 for one day.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
That's kind of ridiculous.
Now, how does corn factor into that? Because it's a little higher carbs and calories, I'm sure.
It's higher carbs.
Okay.
It's not providing a lot of protein,
Yeah.
but it's higher carbs.
Okay.
But some of the stuff ought to start when you start thinking about a lot of the landscapes of the Southeast, and there is food out there, but a lot of it's not quality food. And you start thinking about the Midwest and how, when you think of that volume per day, I mean, most of the landscapes we are food limited in the South.
Interesting. Another factor about that I just want to bring up. Haven't you done an episode like a few years back on the podcast about, is it mineral stumps or mineral sprouts, like with clear cut stuff and the regrowth and like the nutrition content of some of those different species and everything? That's something. So I think it was after we heard an episode. Y'all have done an episode on that, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
After hearing that, it might have been back in like 2020, 2021. It was a while ago. Me and our buddy Michael Pike, we actually went out to a fresh clear cut in the summer and put cameras over some of those and actually found heavy browse, and the bucks and the does hitting those.
That's
was
right.
fascinating. Can you describe what's the term you use for them? Is it mineral stump or what do you call it?
we called them mineral stumps. I mean, stump sprouts,
Yep.
is what it is. And so it's your typical hardwood tree. And just basically when you fell the tree or cut it, the root biomass below is still alive. And so the tree's trying to live. And so it's very much like when you conduct a prescribed fire on a sweet gum that's got a 2-inch stem. You might top kill it, but it's gonna resprout and grow again. So what you're doing there is what is called, and I give credit to Marcus Lashley here. When he was here at MSU Deer Lab, and we worked a lot together, but he really started noticing this observation, and he went to great lengths to test this and look at the nutritive quality. But essentially, you've got a tree, and you top kill it or fell it, and then you've got all of this root biomass below ground, and it is sending up vegetation. And so normally that amount of root biomass is sending up nutrients for the vegetation of the entire tree. And so I'm just going to make some really simple numbers up. So it's taking up below ground this amount of nutrients. So let's just say phosphorus. That normally when it made it to the top of the tree and spread out evenly over all of the foliage, you might have a 8%. That's really, really high. That's not an accurate number. But now when you take all of that root biomass and you are concentrating it in such very little amount of vegetation above that stump, the concentration or the density of those minerals is just off the charts. And so Marcus went out and did a whole bunch of these and did some clippings and did some forage samples, some quality samples. And it's like, my goodness, we got soybean level nutrition in this tree, in this stump sprout.
So it goes back to, you don't necessarily, if you're going out flush cutting some trees like this, and again, talking about that natural regen, that regrowth that happens that first couple, especially year, I guess, after it's been cut, to 2 years, it's like a natural mineral site that you're not actually having to supplement, but it's all across the landscape. And that's one thing, going back to what Mr. Benny's talked about, every time a clear cut would pop up, within the next couple of years, bigger bucks seem to be either showing up, growing, whatever, and these large scale, massive clear cuts and all that regrowth happening. There's an abundance of that nutrition for them for a short period of time. Doesn't last very long, but for a short period of time, it's there on the landscape.
Well, that's why clear cuts can be magnets. You've got that going on, and then you have the forbs that are growing. You have sunlight on the ground, and so you got all the natural variation and all the forage that's grown there, and those mineral stumps.
Interesting. Now, I want to keep pulling at this thread, but before we get off the day versus night beds, like I keep looking back at this slide, and I'm going to ask you a question that you're probably not going to like, because I know you probably aren't going to like the answer to this. This place was like pretty well managed properties, wasn't it? Do you think, this is like total opinion, what is your gut feeling? Like if you were to conduct the same exact study on a very high pressured piece where like guys are really getting after it, like multiple weekdays, weekends, and not just hunting food plots, do you think that this would be different? Just what is your gut feeling?
In what regard? Like what particular facet of the study?
Like the daytime versus nighttime beds. Like they have the same amount of beds. The fidelity of the beds. Like would they have more? Would they be forced to use more secure beds? So it's like, okay, right now they're using 8 or 9. But now there's so much pressure that these 4 are really the safest ones, so they're kind of limited to these 4. Could you see that happening?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that could happen.
And I think also a factor for it would be, what does the habitat and the landscape look like?
Yeah.
If you're in clear country, I don't think it really matters, my opinion. But if you're in like some big wood settings that we know of, where cover's a lot more limited and you have a lot of hunters out there, maybe you have more fidelity on specific bedding areas, maybe not bedding sites, but 1 or 2 bedding areas they really like because of the security cover. That's just, I don't know, that's my thought.
They have less options.
Absolutely.
With that scenario. Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good example though of a place to be studied, because I feel like it is pretty representative of most of the Southeast, because like you have a lot of hunting clubs that do get pressure, but it's usually nothing crazy. Like a lot of clubs, I've only been in this one club for a couple years. Like I've mostly hunted public for the last 10 plus years.
He's a trader now.
I know. You're hunting that privileged land. But like you talk to other people or go to other clubs, and it's pretty similar. Like you'll have a couple guys out there every Saturday, every Sunday there'll be some guys out, and then usually around the holidays there'll be more people out there than normal. But it's just not like the WMAs that we hunt or the national forest that we hunt, because on the national forest, you go out there on Tuesday, there's somebody there. You got not only that, but the people on the national forests and the WMAs or wherever else we're hunting, whatever public we're hunting, they're like in the woods. Like they're hunting the edges of thickets, they're hunting feed trees. Whereas on the private land, in general, people are hunting food plots and feeders. Like it's just kind of 2 different kinds of hunters. So I'd be really curious if there was like ever a study done on the public to see. Actually, Auburn already did it, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. They got the data. Someone just needs to look at it. What the difference is, like, does any of this data like shift or change with where the hunting pressure is being applied? Does that make sense?
Off the top of my head, I can't really think of two things. Remind me to circle back to Oklahoma. Jacob House was the PhD student. He's now a professor, and he worked with Jake Bowman, and this was University of Delaware. And they collared a bunch of bucks, and they found out a lot of great, interesting stuff. But one thing that they saw that was clear and definitive was mortality rate. And so you got these collared bucks, and when they're on public land, they mostly lived. When they ventured over, when that home range took them onto public land, they died.
Wait.
Public.
You said public both.
I'm sorry, private. On private, my bad. On private land, they lived.
Okay.
On public land, they died. So
Okay. You about flipped my world upside
yeah,
down.
yeah. Totally. I got ahead of myself. And so you saw these very distinct survival and mortality curves based on just where they spent time. Now, in terms of deer changing their behavior with hunting pressure, Steve Damaris was part of a project in Oklahoma 15-ish years ago, and they had a very different design than what we were able to do here. They were on a property where they were able to determine areas, and so hunters could draw and go hunt. I don't think it was a bona fide public land, but I think it was a land where people could draw and hunt. But you were either assigned the low intensity hunting area, the high intensity hunting area, and then they also had a control where there was no hunting. So on this population, all these bucks are collared. And so they just started looking at when are we going to see a change in behavior relative to pressure. And the take-home message was it took about 3 days before, here's your word again,
Oh boy.
before buck movement paths became more tortuous, was after about 3 days of having hunters on the landscape. Deer were still bucks, they're still moving, they still got to eat. They were even still moving during the daylight. But where they went and how they navigated, there was a distinct change after about 3 days.
So, you know what that tells me? First day of an SOA hunt, first day of a public land gun hunt is your best opportunity to kill one.
Oh, that's true.
Not day 2, not day 3.
That is true. Oh,
Which
interesting.
we talked about that. So that is super interesting to kind of see that and like the shiftness of everything. So they were still moving, but again, it was a lot more potentially concentrated in specific areas and not doing the longer, I guess.
They're batting down the
treks.
hatches. You know.
Yeah. I mean, so a buck is exposed the most when it's taking these long linear trips. When they are covering more acreage, you increase the opportunity of being seen. But if you are staying in thickets, so you still walk the same distance, but you're not going very far, So we've all hunted in places too. I mean, think about when you're hunting more of a bottomland adjacent to a creek, and there's a lot of cover, switch cane or privet, or deer can move through there, and you might see their feet. You hear them, they're going through there, but man, you can't get a bow shot.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for part 1 of our interview with Dr. Bronson Strickland of Mississippi State University. Part 2 is going to come out next Monday, so y'all be sure to watch out for that. This is a really fun episode. We want your feedback on it. It's really cool that researchers like Dr. Strickland are kind of reaching out more to our community and shows like ours to help disseminate the information that they're learning, but also to get our feedback on what they should actually be studying. That is very, very cool, I think, because they're reaching out to hunters. They're wanting input from us, from our audience, on what questions do we want answered from all this data that they have. So really exciting time to be a deer hunter, in my opinion. We're going to get a lot of questions answered that we've been wondering about for a lot of time. What you got?
Well, I was going to say, some of these questions that you may have, or a lot of us may have, might get answered on this part 2 episode.
Yes.
So if it didn't get answered for you about some questions that you're like, man, I wish we'd study this or look at this, some of that gets answered on next week's episode. So do not miss it at all. And also don't miss this Thursday's episode. We got a pretty cool breakdown with us and some buddies, sitting down, going over all the data, going over the discussion, and really kind of breaking down it in a lot of detail, kind of like some old school breakdown episodes that we used to do a few years back. So,
yes.
Other than that, Andrew, got anything else?
That's going to be it.
Okay. Awesome. Well, appreciate everybody watching the podcast. Appreciate everybody listening to the podcast. Tune in for Thursday's episode for the breakdown, and don't miss next Monday's episode for part 2 with Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State University's Deer Lab. So thank y'all for watching. Thank y'all for listening. We'll catch you back here on the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. And remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.